Greetings. Last time, I looked at the first known recorded game of chess using the modern rules for the moves of the queen and bishop. This time, I'm going to look at one of two other recorded games I know of from before 1500. I thought it was the only one other than the 1475 game from the poem Scotch d'Amour, but I found a second that seems to be genuine. Anyway, in this video, I'm looking at the one played by Lucena. As usual, when recording chess videos, I'm using chess.com's analysis board with the Stockfish chess engine. The Spaniard Luis Ramirez de Lucena wrote the earliest surviving chess text, published in 1497. One other text, published 2 years earlier, is known to have been written by fellow Spaniard Francesc Vicent, but does not survive. Oddly, the rook and pawn ending, known as the Lucena position, does not appear in Lucena's own text, but instead first appears, as far as we know, in a text from the early 1600s written by the Italian Alessandro Salvio. Perhaps it deserves to be known as the Salvio position. You might notice that I'm pronouncing Lucena's name Lucena instead of Lucena or Lucena, both of which I've heard at one time or another. A brief internet search before making this video makes me think that the right pronunciation is Lucena, so that's what I'm going to use. ChessGames.com actually has two Lucena games, but there's significant doubt about the second one's being a genuine game rather than a later fabrication. So I'm only going to show this one Lucena game, played in 1497. You'll notice that his opponent is labeled N.N. That stands for the Latin nomen nescio, which essentially means name unknown, and is used when an opponent's name either really is unknown, or else is left unspecified for some other reason. Whenever I see that, I'm suspicious that the game is not a real game, but is instead a composition. I don't know which is the case in this game. I should note that there's some lengthy, detailed analysis of this game that I'm going to give in the video after this one. I'll make comments on the game in this video, but I'll limit the length of the variations I examine, saving the really lengthy ones for next time. At any rate, to the game. The game began with a Vant Croix opening. It's passive and it's very rare, but it's not bad. Lucena replied with e5, and then we got a reverse French. Black took, and white captured with the queen, which strikes me as odd for three different reasons. First, you're putting the queen out in the middle of the board where it can get kicked around. Black can gain a tempo by developing and attacking it, say by knight to c6, attacking the queen. And then instead of doing what he wants to do, white has to respond to the attack on his queen, so he loses a tempo. So that's first. Second is that had white taken with the pawn, he'd have had a strong central pawn. Taking with the queen, he doesn't have that. And then third is if he'd taken with the pawn, then he'd have had this nice open diagonal for his dark squared bishop. Taking with the queen, he doesn't have that. Although he does later make a virtue of necessity. We'll see that. Black proceeded to play d5, and white retreated his queen, so yes, he lost the tempo. Black brought out his bishop, and you might think he's just giving away a pawn, but he's not. If queen takes pawn, then bishop to b4 check, discovering the attack on the white queen, and the white queen will die. So that's a little trap, and white doesn't fall into it. And now white really is threatening to take the pawn, this time with either the knight or the queen, and black defends it. So now, again, it's poisoned because of bishop to b4 check, discovering the attack on the queen. So again, white can't take the pawn. White develops, black develops, and they continue developing. They continue making developing moves. This b3 move does leave this knight undefended for a moment, but I don't see a way for black to take advantage of it. I'm not sure why h6 was played. Possibly to prevent the knight from coming here and attacking the light square bishop. Possibly to prepare a pawn storm, the king side. I'm not sure. White played bishop to b2, so now white's bishop has this beautiful diagonal, which would not be a beautiful diagonal had there been a pawn there, had there been a white pawn there. So he needed to find another way of developing his bishop because he recaptured with his queen instead of with the pawn. But he did, and he gets a really beautiful diagonal, so he makes a virtue of necessity. Both players move their queens up, and they're both ready to castle. And you might recall that in the first game, the one from the poem, although the queens and the bishops moved the way they normally do in modern chess, it wasn't clear that castling was an accepted rule at the time and place that the game was played, 1475, and in a particular location. The modern rules of castling evolved over time, and they didn't become fully accepted everywhere for centuries. And they became accepted at different places at different times. So when exactly the modern rules of castling became accepted in this part of Spain, I don't know, but we will see black castles and white castles. So it looks as though by 1497, in this part of Spain anyway, the modern castling rules were in force. And now you'll notice the kings are on opposite sides of the board, and you might expect to see a black attack on the king side, possibly with a pawn storm. And you'll expect to see white attack on the queen side, possibly with a pawn storm. So you might expect to see competing attacks on opposite wings. In fact, that doesn't actually happen in this game. Black does attack on the king side, but white doesn't attack on the queen side. Black plays g5, he starts his pawn storm, but there is a problem with this. If white plays knight to b5, the dark square bishop attacks the knight and pins it against the rook. That's a bit of a problem. Now, if black defends it with the queen, defends the knight, then white can take off that bishop, the bishop that was looking so menacingly at white's king side. And then black can't take with the queen because he loses the knight. If he takes with the rook, then I'm not sure whether to call this a skewer or a pin, but white picks up an exchange. So he pretty much has to take the pawn. But then Stockfish really likes white's position after this and continues with knight to d4. And if black plays rook to g8, then Stockfish likes trading knights. And then white's ready to start attacking on the queen side. Black's king positions become a little bit weakened, a little bit opened up. White's ready to start with a pawn storm and attack. And Stockfish thinks this is really good for white. It does look good for white. It certainly looks better for white than it does for black. Okay. If instead black defends the knight, not with a queen, but with this bishop, so if he pulls the bishop back, then Stockfish still prefers white. And we might just look at a few moves. Knight to e5, knight trade, a6, and white wins a pawn on c7. And already we have to think white's better. And you might think that black should save this pawn. Now, obviously, he can't save it this way because he loses the knight. Right? You might think he should try to save the pawn by playing c6. So now the pawn's not attacked by either piece. And it's attacking the knight and saying, go away, knight. Unfortunately, when the knight goes away, it delivers checkmate. This bishop controls that diagonal, so the black king can't move. So that can't be done. So if black plays bishop to e7, Stockfish thinks white's a lot better. So this move g5 weakens the diagonal and leaves this knight undefended and leaves it pinned once this knight gets out of the way. And, well, Stockfish recommends for several moves rolling, several moves running that white play knight to b5, and white never does. Instead, here white moves his knight back. I understand why he did it, but it's not very good. We'll see why he did it. We'll understand in a moment. And Lucena simply continued with his pawn storm. And white played f3. And people often play this sort of move, an advance of one pawn or the other, with the thought that it slows down the pawn storm. But usually, at least very frequently, it doesn't slow down the pawn storm, it accelerates it. Because now when the pawn moves forward, it'll be attacking something, and it'll be threatening to open up the G file. So it frequently doesn't slow down the pawn storm, but speeds it up. However, in this case, white had a reason for playing it. After black's move g4, white plays f4, and black can't open up the G file. Now, had white played, say, a4, and black then played g4, then if white had tried to walk past, no, capture en passant opens the G file for black to attack along. That would not have been good. If he played f3 at this point, well, again, the G file gets opened up. The G file gets opened up. There we go. But, sorry, back up. I have to get rid of that a4 move. There we go. So, by taking two moves, playing f3, and then when black played g4, playing f4, by taking two moves, he prevented this en passant capture. Black can't open up the G file. So that's what white had in mind when he played knight to e1. It's not all that good, but still, I understand. And now we should notice two things about the position. The first thing is that both sides are playing on the king side. Well, the king side is where black wants the play to be. So black's happy here. Black's happy if both sides are playing on the king side. That means black's own king is not coming under attack over on the queen side. If all the play is where you want it to be, well, then you're happy. So, yeah, black should be happy here. All the play is going on the king side where he wants it to go on. That's the first thing to notice. The second thing to notice is that that move f4 actually contains a little bit of a threat. The white pawn is threatening to move to f4, and that bishop won't have anywhere to go. It'll be trapped. Now, whether Lucena simply missed that, or whether he decided to sacrifice the bishop, I don't know. But he continued his pawn storm with h4. And good old N.N Lucena, our name unknown player, went ahead and trapped the bishop. And Stockfish says that what black's best here is to capture with the dark squared bishop, and then check, and then save the bishop, save the late squared bishop. And that way, black has given up a bishop for a pawn, but he has started to open up the white king side. That's not what Lucena did. What Lucena did after f5 was simply to very calmly continue with his pawn storm by moving h3. White went ahead and took the bishop. And Lucena's response was not to recapture the pawn, which is now attacking the queen, but instead to sacrifice the other bishop. And white took. So now black has given up two bishops for a pawn. And Stockfish has white winning by a whole lot. At this point, black's queen is black's queen is under attack by the white e6 pawn, but black doesn't save his queen this move. Instead, he throws in a Zwischenzug, an in-between move, sometimes called an intermezzo. He plays hxg2, discovered check. Since it's check, white can't stop to take the black queen, but has to do something about the check. And he does, he takes the pawn. And now Lucena plays queen to d6, which is a very threatening move. Now, one threat you might notice is if white plays, say, a4, just a nothing move, then black can skewer the white king and queen. That can happen. That's one threat. That's actually not best. There's actually not best. There is a better move. The better move, if white plays a nothing move like a4, is simply checkmate. I like checkmate better. I like checkmate better than skewering the king and the queen. Now you might wonder, suppose if he doesn't play this nothing move a4. Suppose instead he sees this apparently free knight, notices that if his rook captures the knight, then the f1 square will be available for his king to move to if the black queen moves in, so it won't be checkmate anymore. So what if white goes ahead and takes on f6? Well, it loses. It loses. That's the short answer. How does it lose? Well, after queen to h2 check, which forces king to f1, only move possible, and then queen to h1 check, and again, only one move possible, king to f2, and then g3 check, and again, only one move's possible. And then there are a couple of ways you can continue. One is with queen to h4 check. I like rook to d to g8 check. You can see that king's in trouble. Black has a queen and a rook and another rook all attacking that king. And this knight has the potential to come into e5 and also join the attack. You can see this is very bad for white. That king's naked and he's walking around where he shouldn't be. This is not good. This is not good. Now for a really detailed, lengthy analysis of rook takes f6, see my next video. I mentioned that I was going to do some of the really lengthy, detailed analysis in another video, and that's what I'm going to do. So this is one of the bits of analysis that I'm going to give in the next video at somewhat greater length. But the short version is rook takes knight, loses badly. It gets white checkmated. It takes a while. It takes a while, but it gets white checkmated. White ended up playing rook to h1. That stops the queen mate here. It also stops the rook skewer. Now, as it turns out, Stockfish prefers rook to f4 by quite a bit. That, of course, blocks the diagonal. The variations after that become very complicated. So again, next video. Instead, what white played was rook to h1. And I want to notice something here before I continue. This knight can't move to c2 or to d3 or to g2 because they're occupied by his own pieces. And can't move to f3 very well because it'll be captured. So that knight's stuck where it is. Well, if the knight's stuck where it is, then the rook is also stuck on the queen side. It can't get over to the king side to help out with the defense. So that's something to notice. That's something to notice. They trade rooks. Now the second black rook can get over to the king side quickly to help out with the attack. And that's what happens. And white has to move to g1, and that's what he does. Obviously not queen to h2 because of another mate. But he also can't move to g2. He also can't move to g2. Now, one reason why that's a bad idea is that, once again, this knight has nowhere to go, which means this rook is still stuck over here on the queen side. That's one reason it's bad. But there's actually more to it. If you look at Stockfish's evaluation, there's a mate in 9. Now, I don't expect a human being to see a mate in 9. But clearly, that's good reason not to play king to g2. It starts off with queen to h2 check, king to f1, forced, queen to h1 check, king to f2, forced, g3 check, king takes pawn, forced, rook to g8 check. And you can see this looks really, really bad. Stockfish gives white's best move as queen to g4, just completely giving up the queen. The knight attacks it, and so does the rook. Just giving away the queen. When the computer tells you that your best move is to just give away your queen, you know things are bad. So I'll go through this in more detail again in the next video. But you can see this turns out horribly for white. So king to g2 works out horribly for white. White has to play king to g1. That's what our good old Nomen Nescio did, our name unknown player. He played king to g1. And black's queen swooped in. g3 check. We do have to keep in mind that this pawn is sitting here with the threat of taking this pawn and then threatening to make a queen. We do have to keep that in mind. But as long as the attack's going, we can ignore that. And Lucena does. He plays queen to g3 check. And knight to g2 was played. You might notice that if he plays king to f1, then that's checkmate. And if he plays queen to g2, that's another very, very, very complicated variation that, well, set of variations that I'll go over in the next video. But knight to g2 was played, and the computer says it's best. And now black plays knight to e5, and we have to notice that that's a really threatening move. That's a really threatening move. Suppose white plays this, just a4. So we see what black's threatening. Well, what happens is knight to f3 check. And if the king slides over, then checkmate. His only other move is queen takes knight. But if he does that, then after pawn takes, black's threatening mate on g2. If white moves his king over, then that's mate. The pawn controls that square, so the king can't walk away. That's mate. And the only way to defend the knight is with the bishop. But then black doesn't take the knight. He administers checkmate with the pawn. f2 mate. So this knight to e5 move that black just played is really strong. Putting the knight on e5, that's a really strong move, very threatening. There is one more losing option that might occur to you, and that's rook to f1. If that happens, then knight to f3 check, and there's no move other than taking the knight. After the pawn takes, then, well, there are a couple of moves you can try. You can try queen to f2, but then rook to h1 check, king takes rook, queen takes queen. Black has a queen for 3 pieces with this strong pawn, but it's worse than that. Black is also picking up this knight. If white tries to save the knight with knight to f4, then knight to g4 and mate's unstoppable. If instead white tries queen to d2, he has to stay on some square that defends the knight because of the mate threat. If he plays that, then knight to g4, and there's an unstoppable threat of check, king over, checkmate. So that's just a killer, and rook to f1 just does not help. So white instead played queen to f2, the best move. And now the white king has an escape route, and then he'll be able to escape to the queen side. Now that white king has an escape route. And Stockfish likes queen to h3 here. Again, it's very complicated, and I'll look at that in the next video. But I will note that it doesn't just give white a tempo to do whatever he wants to, because there's a mate threat. And white can't simply play queen takes knight for reasons we'll see. So go back. But Lucena did the human thing, played queen to h2 check. And the king slid over one square. And then Lucena played g3. And the best move for white here is queen to g1. And that's very complicated, and I'll look at that in my next video too. These positions became very complicated. However, white didn't play the best move. White instead took the apparently free knight. At this point, white's up 3 pieces. Even at the end of the game, white's going to be up 2 pieces. But, as my master friend likes to say, it's not all about material. At this point, white is lost. Check. King has to come out to e2. Black takes the knight. Now he's down 2 pieces instead of 3. And at this point, white resigned. And white resigned because he's about to get mated. If white plays king to d1, he can play king to d1 or he can play king to e1. Obviously, bringing the queen back is just going to lose the queen. So king to d1 loses to rook in. And then white can block with the bishop or with the queen. It doesn't matter which he blocks with first. They're both going to be lost. Check, which is almost a ladder mate, except that white's queen can take the rook. The queen takes, king has to come forward, and then checkmate. On the other hand, if the white king doesn't go to d1, but instead goes to e1, then black plays knight takes d3 check, which gets rid of the bishop that could go there. The difference between king to d1 and king to e1 is that on e1, the king defends that square, f1. So that if you did play rook in, well then, although black's still winning, white at least has this defense. Whereas with king to d1, the king's not guarding that square, so the immediate rook in just mates in a couple of moves. Black just mates in a couple of moves, a few moves, not a couple. Right. But what if he does play king to e1? Well, if he plays king to e1, then knight takes bishop check, gets rid of one of the pieces that would do the blocking on f1. And you have 2 choices. You can play king to d1 or you can take the knight. If you take the knight, then rook in, queen back, rook takes, and that is a form of ladder mate. That's one option. The other, instead of actually taking the knight, is to slide the king over, but then pretty much the same thing happens. Rook in, queen has to block, rook takes, and once again, we get a ladder mate. So we can see why the game ended after queen takes knight check. So let's just quickly run through the game once again. Van Croy's opening, French reversed, takes with the queen instead of the pawn, and then loses the tempo by moving the queen back. Can't take that pawn, it's not free, it's poisoned. Develop, 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 develop. Developing by fianchettoing the queen's bishop so that the bishop gets this lovely diagonal that it wouldn't have had white recaptured with the pawn. Queen's up, they can both castle, they both do castle, but on opposite wings. You'd expect attacks on opposite wings. That doesn't happen. Lucena does start attacking, but it leaves this knight weak, leaves this diagonal weak. But white never plays knight to b5, which is what he should be playing. He should be playing this knight to b5. Never does. Back, the pawn storm keeps coming. And now there's the threat to trap the bishop. And black allows it. And then sacrifices the second bishop But the discovered check, queen up, threatening mate, the rook trade, swoops in. Really powerful move, as we saw. White now, if he can trade queens, he'll be happy. Black's attack will fizzle, but of course Black's not going to let that happen. And then White blunders by playing queen takes knight instead of playing queen to g1 to keep defending. White grabs another piece, and it's lost. Now it's lost. Check, king up, takes the knight, check, and as we saw, checkmate in a few moves is inevitable from here. Can't be stopped. So it's often easier to be the attacker than to be the defender. And even though Stockfish thought White was winning, still, it was hard for White to keep playing the right defensive moves every move. And Lucena's attack broke through and won. We can see that even 5 centuries ago, a little more than 5 centuries ago, chess was being played the way we play chess now. But we can also see errors being made that we wouldn't expect top players to make these days. Unsurprisingly, or surprisingly, depending on how you look at it, the level of chess played seems like the level of club players today. Next, I'll look at some of the lengthy variations I didn't go over this time. Complications galore. If you like in-depth analysis, it'll be for you. Then I'll move on to look at the chess of Pedro Damiano. As always, try to win, but more, try to play well.